Hi, I'm Gary Striegler. I want to share with you today from my 50 years of experience using routers. Now, if you've never even used a router before, I'm going to share some really great introductory information. If you're kind of familiar with routers, I'm going to try and share some great, neat tricks. And if you're a professional woodworker that makes your living using routers, I still think there's going to be a couple things that I'm going to show you that are going to be interesting. So I hope that you're going to watch this video, you're going to learn, and like me, you're going to fall in love with routers. First off, I just want to kind of do an introduction to routers. Now, this is the first router I ever used over 50 years ago. It was my dad's. It's an example of just what they call a fixed base router, and that just means that you can adjust it, but you're basically just going to control it with your hands. It's got an on-off switch up here. These are probably still the most common type of routers that anybody can use. They're certainly versatile. This can be mounted in a router table. I truly don't use a router table very much. Part of that's because a lot of my career I've been out on the job site and we're used to just grabbing a router, maybe coming up with some sort of a jig system to hold the boards in place while we route them. But one of the other things too is with a handheld router, if the wood's not perfect, and by the way, most of the time wood isn't perfect, it's still going to follow the profile, the shape of the wood and get you a great cut. If I'm running something through a router table, I pretty much need to have it flat against the table and over against the fence to get the cut that I want. And I know tons of people are successful at that. Sometimes I use a router table, but in all honesty, I'm just more of a handheld router guy. So I've already introduced kind of that first, most common type, just the fixed base router. Another type, and this is again one I don't use a ton, but it can be important, is what they call a plunge router. And a plunge router will move up and down. Well, it's hard to do with it, but it'll move up and down like this to make a cut going down in. A lot of woodworkers use those for mortises and such. And it has this turret that's adjustable, so as this pin comes down and hits that turret like that, that controls the depth of your cut. And if I need to go deeper and deeper and deeper, I might start with that one and then pivot around and hit that one, and then again hit that one. And I could also use that if I was, say, putting a profile on something that was a really big profile. For instance, this is a gigantic profile bit right here. And I might want to have the router set up to where I took most of the cut first and then flipped it and made that last little pass. So there's a good bit of reasons to use a plunge router, although it's not one of the ones I use the most. Now I'm going to get to the ones that I absolutely love and I use all the time, and that's a D-handle router. There's several reasons I like a D-handle router. One is I can generally control with one hand. I have great control. You can use two hands, but I can also, and when I'm using one, I put my elbow against my body like that. But one of my favorite things about the D-handle router is the trigger. And I'm never looking around for a switch. I mean, it does have a switch back here, but that on and off lets me turn it on and off without ever wondering about where the switch is. When I get ready to start, I know right where it is. When I get ready to be done, I'll let go. And I can also actually reach a little further with a D-handle router. So it's kind of my personal crusade. If you're listening to me and you got 2 or 3 routers, but you've never owned a D-handle router, I really suggest you get a D-handle router. I think you're going to be like me and fall in love with it. This one is a Dewalt. I've also got several Milwaukee's. I think maybe Makita makes one. I've got some old school Porter ones. You can't get that somewhere. At any rate, there's lots of things to love about a D-handle router. Extremely versatile, and they're really easy to control while you're making the cuts. Now, one of the more recent ones is this cordless They call them a compact router. You can also get this in a corded model, but today's world, I don't know really why anyone would want to do that. One of the really nice things about this is I can grab it down low. I have great control. They're really well balanced. And one of the other things that's super great about them, as soon as I turn that battery off, it shuts off. Now, also some of these, like this for sure, has a light on it that kind of lets you see where you're working. So at any rate, this is everything from kind of the old school, most common fixed base router to plunge routers to D-handle routers, and then the compact routers. So there's lots of different options. Some of them are better for one job than another, but the router is still one of the most versatile, useful tools that you're going to have in your shop. So this router actually will only take a 1/4 inch shank, and that's to somewhat control the size bit that you put in, but you do need to know when you're buying the router and you're buying the bit that sometimes some routers won't take that 1/2 inch bit. Now, most of the bigger routers, almost all of them, are going to come with both 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch collets. Another thing you might want to look for is, for instance, this one has a button right here that you can push to lock the collar when you're changing bits. Some of my routers take 2 wrenches. That can be a pretty handy feature. A lot of routers come with 2 bases. See, this base has a really big hole in it. This base, because it's the same brand router, would swap out, and it's got that place for a bushing to fit up in it. So if you happen to be wanting to use that bushing for a guide, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, make sure that you get a router that has a base that bushing will fit in. Most of these routers are around 2 horsepower to 2 1/4 horsepower, and that's plenty of horsepower, especially if you've got good bits. Golly, I've seen some routers. I think I've actually got one over there. It's like about a 3 horsepower router, but that's more something you're going to put in a router table. And of course, for me, that's getting pretty close to being a shaper. So we talked a little bit about the routers. Now, the second part of that equation is the bits. And part of talking about the bits is how do you guide the cut that the router bit is going to make. The most common type, and this is an example of it, this is a profile bit. This could be a windowsill, it could be a decorative piece of trim on a cabinet, or about anything. And this bit, simply, there's a bearing, should be here. Yeah. The bearing is going to ride on the edge of the wood. You can see here where I started. And one of the nice things is I can go around a corner. I could go around, if I wanted to put a cut on this curve, I could, because the bearing is simply going to follow the wood. Now, a little bit of a hint, to get really good, the cut you want on a router, you've got to make sure that the base of your router stays flush on the wood. In other words, if I'm doing something like that, or worse that, I'm not going to get the cut I want. So make sure that you keep, the base of the router flush. Also, when you turn the router on, this is an important safety feature or safety lesson. Make sure that the bit isn't in contact with the wood when you start it, or else it'll jump back at you. So, when you get ready to route, you want to have, whether you clamp the board or have a way of holding it, but make sure your router's nice and flat, but also that the wood's not in contact with the bit. Then once you start, you go in and have that bearing make really good contact with the edge of the wood. And of course, however smooth or rough this edge is, that's what that bearing is going to repeat. So you always want to have a smooth edge. So one way to make cuts, to use a router, is to make profile cuts. This is an extreme example. These are actually, that and this are exactly the same bit, one just a lot bigger, and that's one of the great things about routers too, is there's multiple sizes of everything. So this is like the extra large version. This is kind of like more the version that we always use. All right. Another way to guide the cut, and I talked about this earlier, is a bushing. And for instance, this bit, see if I can lock it down. That bit is just a spiral cutting bit for cutting mortises, but there's no way to guide that cut. So the way that we guide that cut is by letting this bushing ride against some sort of a guide, a template. And one of the nice things, by the way, I didn't say this about the Plunge Router earlier, but one of the nice things about the Plunge Router is if I back this up enough, I could start where this cutter wouldn't even be anywhere near the wood and then plunge down to make the cut. But using a bushing is another way to guide. All the early stair or hinge template kits that I used a bushing like this. Now the drawback to this is you got to do some math. There's whatever the distance is from the outside of this bushing right there to that cutter. If I want to get an exact size, I have to take that into account when I make my jig. Kind of the opposite of that is, and this is again the great big version of it, but this is what I would call a pattern bit, and it's a bearing that's up above the cutter, and the bearing is the exact size of the cutter. So as that bearing rides on the edge, it's going to remove whatever wood you have sticking out past your pattern. Again, that's a big version of it, but the bearing riding on a pattern makes the cut. There are flush trim bits. They're exactly the opposite. I know I've got one here somewhere. So this is a flush trim bit. Again, the bearing is guiding the cut, but the bearing is on the bottom of the bit instead of on the top. And by the way, this has 3 cutting or 3 flutes, so that's going to tend to cut a little smoother than just 2. And these come in all sorts of different lengths. It's a little bit of a different. This is called a rebate bit, and it makes square cuts, and depending on the distance from this bearing to out here, the size of the rebate that you're going to get. Super quick. Sometimes you'll get a bit that the bearing is actually bigger than the cutter, and part of the benefit of that is you don't ever have to worry about the cutter hitting your whatever kind of guide pattern you're using and messing it up. Again, you do have to do that math where you figure out the distance from the bearing to the cutter to do the pattern that you want. Just super quick, one other one. This is a great one. This is kind of, most of these other cutters I've shown you're kind of working on a horizontal cut like this. This was horizontal. This one's a little bit different. This one would actually go vertically, and it would cut a whole series of flutes in there. Now there's some tricky things about using that, but again, this is kind of a vertically oriented. You'll also see some handrail bits and things that are like that, but that's a vertically oriented bit. Now, I've already talked about several different ways to guide that cut. We talked about just the bearing going against the edge of the wood. Sometimes that bearing is below the cutter. Sometimes it's above. We also talked about a bushing, to guide the cut where this bushing goes against a pattern. Again, that would be, well, can I get this turned around right? Be kind of a guide like that. So that bushing rides against the edge. There is one other way that I occasionally set up to guide a cut, and that is this. This is a jig for this straight cut. This is actually a jig that I use to make mortises or dados in plywood, and this jig is set up, it actually guides off the edge of the router. Now, the important thing for that is every router is a little bit different, every bit's a little bit different. So if you make a jig like this, make sure that you know that I'm going to use this router with this jig. So in a nutshell, that's a whole bunch about the basics of routers. Again, it's one of the most versatile, useful tools that you can possibly have. And you know, again, here's several different examples. If I was going to just buy my first router, you know, you might be tempted, and you wouldn't go wrong just getting a good fixed base router, kind of that general router. And I want to say you can buy those for, you know, it's 2024, maybe $170, $80. If you can possibly swing it, instead get you a D-handle router, and that's probably going to cost you another 30, 40, maybe 50 bucks. There are some kits that you can buy where you take the same router motor and you've got a D handle, you've got that fixed base, and you've also got a plunge base. And you know, that can certainly be a great option, but probably the next thing, if I was just going to buy, you know, once I bought that basic router, that whether it be the fixed base or D handle, I'd sure buy one of these. And you know, this is a Dewalt. It's one I have a whole bunch of. I also have some Milwaukees, and those are good. And a lot of times that's simply going to be based on probably what brand of cordless drill did you buy first, you know, what battery platform did you get on. But at any rate, probably first get you a fixed base or D handle, then get you one of these small compact routers. You're going to love it. And then from there, just maybe continue to buy routers so that you're not changing bits all the time.